October 23rd, 1962, 200 nautical miles north of Cuba. USS Enterprise, the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, maintains station in international waters. As part of the naval quarantine President Kennedy has ordered around Cuba to prevent Soviet delivery of additional military equipment. The carrier has been at sea for 20 days since departing Naval Station Norfolk, Virginia on October 3rd, and will remain on station for another 52 days, a total of 72 days of continuous operations without leaving the area, without refueling, without any limitation on operations imposed by fuel considerations. The flight deck stretches 123 feet, longer than 3 football fields placed end to end, with 90 aircraft positioned in carefully organized arrangements that allow continuous launch and recovery operations. F-4 Phantom fighters been configured for combat air patrol taxi toward the forward catapults, their engines creating deafening noise that reverberates across the steel deck. A-4 Skyhawk attack aircraft armed with iron bombs and rockets await launch for reconnaissance missions over Soviet merchant vessels approaching Cuban waters. E-2 Hawkeye early warning aircraft orbit overhead, their distinctive rotating radar dishes scanning 200 miles in all directions for any aircraft or missiles that might threaten the carrier's strike group. Below the flight deck, in the carrier's engineering spaces far from the salt spray and jet exhaust, 8 Westinghouse A2W nuclear reactors operate quietly and continuously. Each reactor sits in its own heavily shielded compartment, monitored constantly by nuclear-trained engineering personnel who ensure proper cooling, maintain reactor temperatures within specified parameters, and verify that all safety systems function correctly. The reactors heat water to generate steam that drives turbines connected to the ship's 4 propeller shafts. The system is fundamentally similar to conventional steam propulsion. Boil water, create steam, drive turbines, but the heat source is nuclear fission rather than burning fuel oil. This seemingly simple substitution creates revolutionary operational capability. A conventional carrier burning fuel oil to generate steam would consume thousands of gallons per hour, requiring refueling every 5 to 7 days during sustained operations. Enterprise's nuclear reactors require no fuel beyond the enriched uranium already loaded in their cores, uranium that will provide energy for 15 to 25 years of operations before requiring replacement during scheduled refueling overhauls. The operational implications manifest immediately during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Enterprise launches more than 200 sorties daily. Fighters on combat air patrol, attack aircraft on reconnaissance missions, anti-submarine aircraft searching for Soviet submarines, refueling tankers, supporting aircraft that need extended range, electronic warfare aircraft monitoring Cuban radar systems. Each launch requires steam from the ship's catapults, electrical power for deck operations, aviation fuel for aircraft, and ordnance for combat-configured missions. Enterprise provides all these requirements continuously, day after day, without constraints imposed by the ship's own fuel supply. Conventional carriers operating in the same waters face different realities. USS Independence and USS Essex, both conventional carriers participating in the quarantine, require underway replenishment every 5 to 7 days, steaming to rendezvous points where oiler ships transfer thousands of tons of fuel oil while the carrier maintains reduced operations during refueling. Soviet naval forces observing these operations from their own ships operating nearby recognize immediately the strategic advantage nuclear propulsion provides. The Soviet helicopter carrier Moskva, deployed to support Soviet submarines operating in Cuban waters, carries conventional steam turbines that require regular refueling. During the 72 days Enterprise maintains station, Moskva requires 11 separate refueling operations from oiler support ships. Each refueling requires Moskva to leave its operational area, steam to the rendezvous point, sometimes hundreds of miles away, spend hours conducting alongside refueling, and return to patrol areas. The refueling cycles consume substantial portions of Moskva's operational time, reduce its effectiveness in supporting submarine operations, and create predictable patterns that American intelligence can monitor and exploit. Soviet Admiral Sergey Gorshkov, reviewing reports from Soviet naval forces during the crisis, acknowledges in classified assessments sent to Soviet political leadership that American nuclear carrier capability represents a technological achievement. Soviet naval forces cannot currently match and creates sustained presence capabilities that fundamentally exceed Soviet carrier capabilities, regardless of how many conventional carriers the Soviet Union might build. To understand why nuclear propulsion created such decisive advantages, you need to understand the operational constraints conventional carriers faced. A conventional aircraft carrier like USS Midway or USS Coral Sea, both operational during the 1960s and representative of American conventional carrier capabilities, displaced approximately 60,000 tons and carried 75 aircraft. The ships were powered by steam turbines that required fuel oil, vast quantities of it. A carrier operating at cruising speed consumed approximately 100,000 gallons of fuel oil daily. At maximum speed during combat operations or high-intensity flight operations, consumption could exceed 200,000 gallons per day. The carrier's fuel bunkers held approximately 2 million gallons, sufficient for roughly 20 days of operations before requiring refueling. In practice, carriers never depleted fuel bunkers entirely because maintaining some reserve was essential for emergencies, meaning effective operational range without refueling was perhaps 15 days. This fuel requirement imposed multiple constraints on carrier operations. First, the carriers needed to dedicate enormous internal volume to fuel oil storage, space that could not be used for aviation fuel, weapons, provisions, or other operational supplies. Second, carriers required frequent underway replenishment from oiler support ships, creating dependency on logistics that limited operational flexibility. Third, the need for regular refueling made carrier movements somewhat predictable. Adversaries could anticipate when carriers would need to leave operational areas for refueling, potentially exploiting these periods for activities the carrier presence was intended to deter. Fourth, extended deployments far from friendly ports required extensive logistics planning to ensure oiler support would be available, limiting spontaneous response to crises that might emerge in areas without established logistics support. Nuclear propulsion eliminated virtually all these constraints. Enterprise required no fuel oil whatsoever. The nuclear reactors provided all power for propulsion and ship systems. The space that would have held 2 million gallons of fuel oil in a conventional carrier became available for other uses. The development path that produced Enterprise began in the 1950s when the United States Navy recognized that nuclear propulsion, already proven in submarines with USS Nautilus commissioning in 1954, could revolutionize surface ship operations if successfully adapted to carrier applications. The technical challenges were formidable. Submarine nuclear reactors were relatively compact because submarines were small and operated with limited crew. An aircraft carrier required vastly more power to drive a ship, displacing 90,000 plus tons at 30 plus knot speeds needed to provide electrical power for entire cities' worth of equipment and personnel. The A2W design produced 35,000 horsepower from each reactor, requiring 8 reactors total to provide the 280,000 horsepower necessary for carrier propulsion. Each reactor occupied a heavily shielded compartment with multiple redundant cooling systems, safety systems, and monitoring equipment. The reactors used pressurized water design, where primary cooling water circulated through the reactor core, absorbing heat from nuclear fission, transferred that heat to secondary water systems through steam generators, and the secondary system steam drove the turbines. This approach kept radioactive primary cooling water completely separate from steam that drove turbines, ensuring that maintenance personnel working on turbines never encountered radioactive materials. The multiple redundant safety systems ensured that loss of cooling, the failure mode that could cause reactor damage, was virtually impossible. If primary cooling pumps failed, natural circulation would continue moving water through the core. If electrical power was lost, emergency diesel generators would immediately activate. If cooling water was lost, emergency core cooling systems would flood the reactor with coolant from reserve tanks. Construction of Enterprise began at Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia in February 1958. The shipyard had extensive experience building conventional carriers, but faced unprecedented challenges constructing the world's first nuclear carrier. The keel measured 1,123 feet in length, requiring specialized facilities to accommodate construction of a ship larger than any warship previously built. The whole structure incorporated 8 separate reactor compartments, each with shielding designed to contain radiation during normal operations and prevent release even if reactor systems failed. The island superstructure positioned on the starboard side of the flight deck was unique among carriers. Without smokestacks required for conventional boilers, designers created a squared structure that housed a phased array radar system called SCANFAR, providing advanced air search and tracking capability no other carrier possessed. The flight deck spanned 4.5 acres with 4 C-13 steam catapults capable of launching 80,000-pound aircraft, 4 arresting wires for recovering aircraft, and deck space to spot 90-plus aircraft in configurations that allowed simultaneous launch and recovery operations. The hangar deck below provided maintenance space for aircraft, with elevators moving aircraft between hangar and flight deck. The ship's complement included 3,000 Shipbuilding Company personnel operating the vessel and 2,828 air wing personnel maintaining and flying aircraft. Total crew of 5, 828 larger than the population of many American small towns and comparable to the entire population of some Soviet military towns built around single installations. The cost reflected the revolutionary nature of the ship. Enterprise's construction cost reached $451 million in 1961, the most expensive warship ever built at that time, and approximately 10 times the cost of contemporary conventional carriers. Congress debated whether nuclear carriers justified their enormous expense, with critics arguing that multiple conventional carriers could be built for the price of one nuclear ship. Proponents countered that operational costs favored nuclear power. Enterprise required no fuel oil purchases, reducing per-day operational costs below conventional carriers, despite higher construction expense. The debate would continue throughout Enterprise's construction and commission, with ultimate vindication coming through operational performance that demonstrated capabilities no conventional carrier could match. When Enterprise commissioned on November 25, 1961, it immediately became the most powerful warship afloat. Initial sea trials validated the nuclear propulsion system, with the ship achieving speeds exceeding 33 knots sustained for hours without any indication of performance degradation. Conventional carriers conducting maximum speed runs would see fuel consumption rates that limited high-speed operations to brief periods. Enterprise sustained maximum speed as long as engineering personnel wanted to test the systems, demonstrating that nuclear propulsion fundamentally changed naval operations by eliminating fuel as a constraint on tactical employment. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 provided Enterprise's first operational test just 11 months after commissioning. When President Kennedy ordered naval quarantine of Cuba on October 22, 1962, Enterprise was among the first carriers to arrive on station. The carrier's operational performance during the 72-day crisis deployment established patterns that would define Enterprise operations throughout its career. The ship maintained station continuously, operating flight operations throughout each day, launching and recovering aircraft on schedules determined entirely by operational requirements rather than fuel considerations. The sustained sortie rate, more than 200 per day, demonstrated that the ship could maintain high operational tempo indefinitely. Soviet forces observing these operations recognized they were witnessing capabilities that Soviet conventional carriers could not replicate. The comparison with Soviet carriers operating during the crisis illustrated the magnitude of the capability gap. Moskva, the Soviet helicopter carrier deployed to support submarine operations, displaced 15,000 tons and carried 18 Kamov Ka-25 helicopters. The ship was powered by conventional steam turbines producing 100,000 horsepower, providing 31-knot maximum speed but requiring refueling every 5 to 7 days during sustained operations. Vietnam War operations from 1965 through 1975 demonstrated Enterprise's sustained operational capabilities under combat conditions. The ship conducted 6 combat deployments to Southeast Asia, spending more than 20 years total supporting operations over North and South Vietnam. The 1965 deployment to Yankee Station, the operations area in the Gulf of Tonkin where carriers launched strikes into North Vietnam, lasted 125 days of continuous on-station time. Enterprise launched more than 13,000 sorties during this deployment without ever leaving station for refueling. The conventional carriers operating on Yankee Station, USS Coral Sea, USS Midway, USS Hancock, required 10 to 14-day refueling breaks during comparable deployments, leaving station to steam to Subic Bay in the Philippines, or conducting underway replenishment that reduced operational tempo for days at a time. Enterprise maintained pressure continuously, launching strikes daily throughout the deployment period, without operational gaps that allowed North Vietnamese forces respite from air attacks. The 30-day operational cycles Enterprise sustained without resupply demonstrated nuclear propulsion advantages under combat conditions. The carrier would launch strike packages daily, A-6 intruder all-weather attack, aircraft conducting night strikes against North Vietnamese targets, A-4 Skyhawks attacking supply routes, F-4 Phantoms, providing fighter escort and conducting air superiority missions. Each sortie consumed aviation fuel and ordnance but required no fuel from the ship's propulsion system. Enterprise periodically conducted underway replenishment to receive aviation fuel, ordnance, and provisions, but these replenishment operations were scheduled around operational requirements rather than dictated by the ship's fuel state. Conventional carriers' replenishment cycles were dominated by their own fuel requirements. They needed fuel oil for propulsion before they needed aviation fuel or ordnance, forcing replenishment schedules that sometimes occurred when aviation fuel and ordnance stocks were still adequate, but the ship's bunkers were depleting. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964 had already demonstrated Enterprise's rapid response capability. When North Vietnamese patrol boats engaged American destroyers on August 2nd and 4, Enterprise arrived on station 3 days later and maintained continuous operations for 8 months without returning to port for fuel. Conventional carriers participating in the response required regular port visits or extended underway replenishment operations that interrupted their presence on station. Enterprise's sustained presence sent unambiguous message about American commitment and capability. The carrier would remain as long as necessary without logistics constraining operations. Indian Ocean operations during the 1970s and 1980s established Enterprise as cornerstone of American naval presence in a region where Soviet influence was expanding. The Soviet Union had established naval facilities in Somalia, Yemen, and other Indian Ocean littoral states, creating infrastructure to support extended Soviet naval operations far from Soviet home ports. American response involved sustained carrier presence to demonstrate that Soviet expansion would face persistent American naval power. Enterprise deployments to the Indian Ocean typically lasted 6 to 8 months, with the carrier operating from Diego Garcia and conducting presence operations throughout the region. Soviet carriers attempting to establish comparable presence required extensive logistical support that Soviet infrastructure in the region could barely sustain. Soviet deployments were measured in weeks rather than months, and Soviet carriers spent substantial time conducting logistics operations rather than operational presence that Enterprise maintained routinely. The 1980 Iranian hostage crisis demonstrated Enterprise's crisis response capability under demanding conditions. When Iranian revolutionaries seized American diplomatic personnel in November 1979, Enterprise deployed to the Indian Ocean to provide military options for potential rescue operations and to demonstrate American capability to project power into the region despite Iranian hostility. The carrier remained on station for more than 180 days, operating in the North Arabian Sea and preparing for potential military action while diplomatic efforts continued. The unsuccessful rescue attempt in April 1980, Operation Eagle Claw, involved other forces, but Enterprise provided air cover and search and rescue capability throughout the operation. The sustained presence Enterprise maintained throughout the crisis, 6 months without leaving the region, was possible only because nuclear propulsion eliminated refueling requirements that would have forced conventional carriers to rotate off station periodically. Soviet Admiral Gorshkov, assessing American nuclear carrier operations throughout the 1970s, acknowledged in classified assessments and published writings that American nuclear carriers created permanent presence capabilities that Soviet naval forces could not counter without developing comparable nuclear propulsion technology. Gorshkov recognized that the strategic balance in naval power was shifting toward nations that could maintain sustained overseas presence, and that conventional propulsion limited Soviet carrier effectiveness regardless of how many ships the Soviet Union built. His advocacy for Soviet nuclear carrier development met with limited success. Political leadership questioned whether the enormous expense justified uncertain benefits, and Soviet shipbuilding capacity was already committed to submarine construction and conventional surface combatant programs. Desert Storm in 1991 provided another demonstration of Enterprise nuclear propulsion advantages under modern combat conditions. The carrier deployed from the East Coast in December 1990, transited to the Persian Gulf and Red Sea, and conducted combat operations throughout the 43-day air campaign from January 17th through February 28th, 1991. Enterprise launched 2,900 sorties during the campaign, more than any other carrier participating in Desert Storm. The ship operated in the Red Sea, launching aircraft that flew over Saudi Arabia to strike targets throughout Iraq and Kuwait. The 7-month deployment from departure through return to Norfolk required zero fuel for Enterprise itself. The conventional carriers participating in Desert Storm, USS America, USS Saratoga, USS Ranger, all required underway replenishment every 5 to 7 days, conducting frequent fuel transfers from oiler ships that temporarily reduced flight operations and created logistics burden that Enterprise avoided entirely. Cost comparisons during Desert Storm illustrated nuclear propulsion economic benefits during sustained operations. Enterprise fuel cost for the entire 7-month deployment was zero. The nuclear reactors required no fuel purchases, operating on uranium cores loaded during the previous refueling overhaul years earlier. Conventional carriers consumed millions of dollars worth of fuel oil during comparable deployments. The fuel cost differential during a single deployment could exceed $50 million, substantially offsetting the higher construction cost of nuclear carriers when amortized over their operational lives. The end of the Cold War from 1989 through 1991 found Enterprise maintaining Mediterranean and Atlantic patrols as Soviet power collapsed. Soviet carriers attempting to establish presence during this period illustrated the persistent limitations of conventional propulsion. Admiral Kuznetsov, commissioned in 1990 as the Soviet Union's first full-deck carrier comparable to American supercarriers, made a single deployment to the Mediterranean before the Soviet Union dissolved. The deployment required extensive oiler support, with Kuznetsov conducting frequent refueling operations that Soviet logistics struggled to support as Soviet infrastructure deteriorated. American intelligence observed that Soviet carrier operations remained constrained by conventional propulsion limitations, even in the most modern Soviet carrier design, validating the assessment that nuclear propulsion provided fundamental advantages that conventional systems could not overcome through design improvements or operational procedures. Post-Cold War operations continued Enterprise's pattern of sustained presence and crisis response. The carrier participated in operations supporting Bosnian operations in the 1990s, conducted missions supporting Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan after September 11, 2001, and deployed again to support Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003. Each deployment demonstrated the same pattern. Enterprise could deploy rapidly, maintain station indefinitely, conduct high-tempo operations without fuel constraints, and sustain presence that conventional carriers couldn't match without rotation or extensive logistics support. The reason Soviet naval forces never matched Enterprise's nuclear carrier capability reflected multiple factors, constraining Soviet naval development. The technology gap was fundamental. American nuclear reactor development began in the 1940s under Admiral Rickover's leadership, producing compact, reliable reactors for submarine applications by the early 1950s. Soviet nuclear submarine development lagged American programs by approximately 5 years, and Soviet naval reactor designs were generally larger and less efficient than American equivalents. Adapting nuclear reactors for carrier applications required miniaturization beyond what Soviet reactor designs achieved, creating technical challenges Soviet engineers struggled to overcome even into the 1980s. Industrial capacity constraints compounded technology limitations. Building nuclear carriers required specialized facilities with capabilities exceeding conventional shipbuilding. Newport News Shipbuilding, which constructed Enterprise and subsequent American nuclear carriers, invested enormous resources developing specialized equipment, training specialized workforce, and creating manufacturing processes for nuclear carrier construction. Soviet shipyards possessed impressive capabilities for conventional warship construction, but lacked the specialized equipment and trained workforce necessary for nuclear carrier applications. Developing this capacity would have required investments comparable to building the carriers themselves, creating front-end costs that Soviet economic planning struggled to justify. Economic considerations influenced Soviet decisions against nuclear carrier development. Enterprise cost $451 million in 1961, approximately $4.5 billion in modern currency accounting for inflation. This represented perhaps 1% of the entire Soviet defense budget, an enormous investment in a single platform whose benefits weren't certain when construction began. Soviet economic planners questioned whether nuclear carriers justified their cost, particularly given Soviet naval doctrine that emphasized coastal defense and submarine operations, rather than global power projection requiring sustained overseas carrier presence. Building a fleet of nuclear carriers comparable to American capabilities would have required diverting resources from other priorities: submarine construction, surface combatant development, strategic missile programs that Soviet leadership considered more essential to Soviet security. Safety concerns became significant following the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in April 1986. Soviet leadership's confidence in nuclear power safety was severely shaken by Chernobyl, creating a political environment where proposing nuclear-powered surface ships faced skepticism about whether adequate safety could be ensured. Nuclear submarines operated underwater, where potential accidents would be less visible to public scrutiny. But nuclear carrier accidents would occur in ports or at sea in highly visible circumstances that could create political disasters comparable to Chernobyl. This risk aversion made Soviet political leadership reluctant to approve nuclear carrier development, even when Soviet Navy advocated for such programs. Operational doctrine differences further reduced Soviet motivation to develop nuclear carriers. Soviet naval strategy throughout the Cold War emphasized submarine warfare, coastal defense, and supporting ground operations rather than global power projection. Soviet carriers were designed to support submarine bastions, protected areas where Soviet ballistic missile submarines could operate under cover of Soviet naval and air forces. This mission did not require sustained overseas presence or unlimited range. Soviet carriers operated relatively close to Soviet territory where conventional logistics could support them adequately. American carriers operated globally, conducting presence missions in areas thousands of miles from American territory where conventional propulsion logistics were extremely challenging. Nuclear propulsion solved problems American carriers faced that Soviet carriers largely avoided through their different operational employment. By the time Soviet engineers developed nuclear reactor designs suitable for carrier applications in the late 1980s, the Cold War was ending, and Soviet economic crisis made new carrier construction politically impossible. The Ulyanovsk-class nuclear carrier designed in the late 1980s would have displaced 80,000 tons with nuclear propulsion, comparable to American nuclear carriers. But construction was canceled in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. The single hull laid down was scrapped incomplete, representing the closest Soviet naval forces ever came to fielding nuclear carrier capability. The result was that Soviet Navy never operated a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. Admiral Kuznetsov, commissioned in 1990, remains Russia's only fleet carrier today, more than 3 decades after commissioning. The ship operates with conventional propulsion that requires refueling every 3,500 nautical miles at cruising speed, creating persistent logistics challenges that limit Russian carrier operations. The ship's engineering reliability problems have become notorious, requiring tugboat escort during deployments because the propulsion system has failed multiple times, leaving the carrier adrift. The contrast with American nuclear carriers operating reliably for decades, sustaining unlimited range at any speed, requiring no refueling throughout their operational lives, illustrates the fundamental differences between the technologies. Enterprise's legacy extended far beyond its own impressive operational record to establish nuclear propulsion as the standard for American carrier development. The success Enterprise demonstrated during Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam operations, and subsequent deployments convinced American naval and political leadership that nuclear propulsion justified its cost through operational capabilities no conventional system could match. This conviction led to the Nimitz-class carrier program that produced 10 nuclear supercarriers commissioned between 1975 and 2009. Each Nimitz-class carrier displaced approximately 100,000 tons, operated with 2 A4W nuclear reactors, providing 260,000 horsepower, and could sustain 30-plus knot speeds with unlimited range. The class represented evolutionary improvement over Enterprise. More efficient reactors requiring fewer units, improved damage control, better aircraft maintenance facilities, while maintaining the fundamental nuclear propulsion advantages Enterprise pioneered. The Gerald R. Ford-class carriers entering service beginning in 2017 continue American nuclear carrier tradition with further improvements. The Ford class operates with 2 A1B nuclear reactors that produce more power with improved efficiency compared to Nimitz-class reactors. The reactor cores are designed for 50-year service life, meaning Ford-class carriers will operate their entire commissioned lives without requiring refueling overhauls that Nimitz-class and Enterprise required periodically. The Ford class also incorporates electromagnetic catapults replacing steam catapults, advanced arresting gear, improved aviation facilities, and numerous other improvements, but the foundation remains nuclear propulsion, providing unlimited range and sustained high-tempo operations that define American carrier capability. Soviet and Russian carrier development stagnated following the Cold War. Admiral Kuznetsov remains Russia's only operational carrier, conducting limited deployments constrained by conventional propulsion and persistent engineering problems. Russian plans for future carriers remain aspirational rather than concrete programs. Proposals exist for nuclear carriers that would provide capabilities comparable to American designs, but Russian shipbuilding capacity and defense budgets make such programs unlikely in the foreseeable future. Chinese carrier development has followed evolutionary path similar to Soviet-Russian experience. China's first 2 carriers, Liaoning and Shandong, use conventional propulsion derived from Soviet design concepts. The ships displace approximately 60,000 tons and operate with conventional steam turbines requiring regular refueling. China's third carrier, Type 003, launched in 2022, continues using conventional propulsion, though with electromagnetic catapults, similar to American Ford class. Chinese naval literature discusses future nuclear carrier development, tentatively designated Type 04, but concrete programs have not yet produced hulls under construction. Chinese assessment of American nuclear carrier operations acknowledges that nuclear propulsion provides decisive operational advantages, but Chinese naval development remains decades behind American capabilities. The strategic impact of American nuclear carrier dominance extends beyond just the ships themselves to enabling global presence no other nation can sustain. Nuclear carriers can respond to crises anywhere in the world within days of orders issuing, maintaining high-tempo operations, indefinitely without refueling, sustaining presence that demonstrates American commitment more credibly than limited-duration deployments conventional carriers require. During the Cold War, this capability meant American carriers could maintain presence in regions where Soviet influence threatened American interests: Mediterranean, Indian Ocean, Western Pacific, providing persistent American power that Soviet conventional carriers couldn't match. Post-Cold War, American carriers have maintained presence supporting every major American military operation, providing the foundation for power projection that conventional forces cannot replicate. No other nation achieved comparable nuclear carrier capability throughout the 60-plus years since Enterprise commissioning. This remains a unique American advantage that shapes naval competition and influences how nations approach maritime power projection. Nations operating conventional carriers, France, United Kingdom, China, India, all face limitations from conventional propulsion that constrain their operations similarly to how Soviet carriers were constrained during the Cold War. Nuclear propulsion technology remains closely guarded, with the United States sharing reactor technology only with United Kingdom through special agreements dating to the 1950s. Other nations attempting to develop indigenous nuclear carrier capability face technical challenges, industrial requirements, and economic costs that have consistently proven more difficult than conventional carrier development. Enterprise decommissioned in December 2012 after 51 years of operational service, more than twice its 25-year design life. The extended service reflected both the durability of the ship's basic design and the effectiveness of maintenance programs that kept systems operational decades beyond original expectations. Enterprise received 3 refueling overhauls during its service life. 1964, 1969, 1979, 1982, and 1990-1994, each involving removing the reactor's spent fuel cores, installing fresh cores, and conducting comprehensive modernization of ship systems. Between refuelings, the reactors operated for 25 years without requiring additional nuclear fuel, demonstrating the extraordinary energy density of nuclear power compared to conventional fuel oil. The statistics Enterprise compiled during 51 years of service illustrate the revolution nuclear propulsion created in naval operations. The ship traveled more than 1 million nautical miles, equivalent to circumnavigating the globe more than 46 times. It conducted 25 major deployments, participated in every significant American military operation from Cuban Missile Crisis through Operation Iraqi Freedom, and launched more than 400,000 aircraft during its operational life. During this entire period, Enterprise experienced 0 nuclear accidents, 0 operational limitations due to fuel shortages, and 0 requirements to reduce operations because of propulsion system constraints. The reliability record validated Admiral Rickover's vision that nuclear naval propulsion could provide safe, reliable power for sustained operations under the most demanding conditions. When Soviet naval officers, observing Enterprise operations during the Cuban Missile Crisis, reported to Admiral Gorshkov that American carriers operated for weeks without refueling, while Soviet ships required constant logistic support, they were documenting a technological gap that would define naval competition throughout the Cold War. Soviet carriers were ships, impressive engineering accomplishments that extended Soviet reach beyond coastal waters, but ultimately constrained by conventional propulsion that required regular refueling and limited operational flexibility. Enterprise was a mobile airbase powered by nuclear reactors that never needed fuel, carrying 90 aircraft and 5,800 personnel capable of deploying anywhere in the world and remaining on station indefinitely. The difference was an incremental improvement in conventional capabilities. It was fundamental transformation of what naval forces could accomplish through technological innovation that changed the rules of maritime power projection. Soviet carriers were ships. Enterprise was mobile airbase that never needed fuel.